Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 192, IO 540, D to E. It isn't that Socrates forces Io to agree with things which ruin Io's idea about rhapsody, but Io himself agrees that any craftsman will be able to speak better about his particular subject than a rhapsode would. This is Io's problem, not Socrates. Socrates is simply exposing the problem. Io attempts to solve the problem by claiming that rhapsody deals with the sorts of things that various types of people would say. But even this is the same idea that there is a subject matter which they have to say. For example, the helmsman knows better than a rhapsode what to say about a ship in a storm. A physician knows better than a rhapsode what to say about someone sick. Even a slave knows better than a rhapsode what to say to calm down his oxen, and a woman knows better than a man what to say about making thread from wool. As I suggested last time, Io should have said that the rhapsode knows better how to speak. He's the one who conveys the message of the poet. The poets of the oral tradition have composed the words, but it is the rhapsode who acts the words out. All the latest examples, the helmsman, the physician, the oxherd, and the spinner, are all being portrayed by Socrates as rulers. They are rulers of their subject matter. Even the slave is a ruler of his oxen. These are clearly not the rulers Io was talking about, and Socrates now comes towards Io with an example of a ruler which seems a bit more to the point. This is not the archon of the city, not one of the administrators elected every year in Athens, but the ruler of an army. This sounds quite epic. This is the sort of thing we would find in Homer. So let's see what Socrates says and how Io responds. Alhoia andri prepe epen gnosetai stratego stratiotais parainunti? Nai tato alta gnosetai ho rhapsodos. But he will know what sort of things it is fitting for a man to say, who is a general encouraging his soldiers. Yes, the rhapsode will know things like this. Socrates has now asked about all four of the types of people Io had raised. He had suggested that the rhapsode would know what sort of things it is fitting for such types of people to say, and these types of people were the woman, the man, the slave, and the ruler. Socrates had begun with the ruler and had the ruler of a ship, the ruler of a sick person, so in other words, the helmsman and the physician. Then he went on to the opposite of the ruler, the slave, but the slave was actually the ruler of oxen. He was an oxherd. And then he went on to the woman, but the woman was the ruler of wool, and she knew how to spin. And now he is talking about the opposite of the woman, the man. As apparently the man is not the same as the ruler, at least not in these examples. But then that's Io's problem in the first place. He was the one who brought up the different types of people. Socrates could have chosen as examples of men, for example, a helmsman or a physician. And arguably he could have mentioned the oxherd, although the techne of oxherd is not one associated with a man. The Greek word aner is a hero sort of man, not a slave sort of man. It is interesting that as an example of the archon, Socrates hadn't chosen a general. Instead, he had chosen the helmsman and the physician, but the man or the ruler would be the sort of person who would be a general. Having turned this type of person, just like the other types, into a ruler of some subject matter, in other words, he's turned the man into a technites. In this case, he has the techne strategike, the craft or skill of leading an army. And then, just as in the other examples, he adds a particular activity. And this particular activity is giving encouragement to soldiers. Now, this is the sort of thing we do see commanders in Homer doing. This is one of their most important functions. When they encourage their soldiers, we also learn about what they're going to do. It's a sort of info dump in ancient Greek. In the Iliad, we also get to see how bad some leaders are. Agamemnon causes the Greeks to retreat when he talks, and it's up to Odysseus to rally the troops. We're very used in literature to hearing commanders exhort their troops, but did they really do it? This is arguably one place where a poet has an advantage over a real general, because real generals don't shout to all of their army just before a battle. They usually just send commands through their officers to the troops, and they're sending general messages such as the target they should be aiming at. Even the formation they take is usually left to the senior officers in charge of the major formations. By the end of the 5th century BC, responsible generals would stay out of the battle. They would be behind the army, and in that case, I would suggest that it would be very unlikely that they also gave speeches before the battle. The general is in charge of the army as a whole. It is not his job, unless he's an idiot like Alexander the Great, to get involved in the actual fighting. Socrates continues, Tide, he rhapsodike techne strategike estin? What then? The rhapsodic techne is the strategic techne. In other words, the techne of the rhapsode is also the techne of the general. This question follows from the assumption Io has had all along that the subject matter is exclusive to one techne. Therefore, if the rhapsode and the general have the same subject matter, they must have the same techne, which would mean that the rhapsode is a general and the general is a rhapsode. The only problem with this is that in fact Io is not a general, he's only a rhapsode. Io clarifies where his strength lies. Gnoien gunan egoge hoia strategon prepe pen. I would know at any rate the sort of things it is fitting that a general says. It's noticeable that Io says strategon and not stratego. He uses the accusative rather than the dative, so that instead of knowing what sort of things it is fitting for a general to say, Io says that he knows the sort of things it is fitting that a general says. I suspect that there's been a simple textual error, and he does actually say that he knows the sort of things that it is fitting for a general to say. It doesn't make much philosophical difference. The problem is that he's still talking about the subject matter. The sort of things a general should say is not the same as how a general should say what he says. And by the principle of exclusivity of subject matter, Io has to decide whether he's a rhapsode or a general when he says what a general is supposed to say. This is the point Socrates now makes. Isos gar kai strategikos o ion. For perhaps you are also a general, Io. This would allow Io to be a rhapsode somehow, but when it comes to knowing what a general should say, Io must be a general. He must have the strategike techne. Socrates now explains this point with other examples, as if we need other examples by now. Kaigar etunchenes hippikoson hamakai kitharistikos egnos an hippus io kai kakos hippadzomenus. For if you happen to be both a horseman and at the same time a kithara player, you would recognize those riding horses well and badly. Al essego eromen, potera de techne o ion, gignoskes tus iu hippadzomenus hippus, hei hippius hei kitharistes, ti an moi epikrino, hei hippius egogan. But if I were to ask you, by which techne, Io, do you recognize the ones riding horses well? By the techne by which you are a horseman, or by the techne by which you are a kithara player? What would you answer me? By the techne by which I am a horseman, I would say. We can see where this argument is going, but it's worth noticing at this point that Io is not claiming that he recognizes those who lead armies well and badly, but he simply knows what sort of things a general would say. Socrates' analogy only works from the point of view of the exclusivity of the subject matter of technai. If he knows something about generalship, it is surely in his capacity as a general and not as a rhapsode. This is the point Socrates will be making.